I just want to start by recognizing that this talk is taking place on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders, both past and present. And welcome any Indigenous participants we have in this seminar. I'm pleased to announce that this is the completion seminar of one of my PhD students, Sarah Moneer. Sarah, I'll pass it over to you and allow you to go ahead and do your talk.
Thank you. Can you just close the door?
Sorry, before you start, can I just ask, because I can't, like you're very small for me now, is Philip Smith also there, or?
He is not going, he can't make it today.
He can't make it, cool. I just need this for the form. That's all good, thank you.
All right, so to set the scene for this presentation, I would like you all to imagine a scenario that should be very familiar to all of you. You've just come home, you walk into your living room, and out pops a spider. And you need to decide whether this spider is a friendly household spider or whether it's something venomous. And you might do that by looking at the features of the head, like fang orientation, eye configuration, and the features of the body, like color and shape. But how would you actually process this information? So in this talk, when I refer to information processing, I'm talking about mental architectures, or the ways in which information is processed and integrated in decision-making that are outside of conscious control. If we assume that the head and body can be processed independently, then we might process the features of the head first, and then the body in a sequential manner under a serial architecture. And so in this case, the response time would simply be the sum of the two decision times. We could also process both the head and the body simultaneously under a parallel architecture. And in this case, the response time would be the longest of the two processing times. Alternatively, we might not see the spider as a collection of parts at all. We might have this one whole representation of spider. And in this case, information from the spider would be pulled into a single spider channel and processed under a coactive architecture. And the response time would be however long it takes for this channel to complete. For serial and parallel architectures, we also need to consider stopping rules. So in the examples that I've just shown you, both features were processed before response is made. So this is called an exhaustive stopping rule. But if the spider has a distinguishing feature on one part, say on the body, then you would be able to reach a correct decision without processing both parts. So in this case, processing can self-terminate once one of the dimensions is completed. So under a serial self-terminating architecture, the total response time would be however long it takes to complete processing in this channel. And in a parallel self-terminating architecture, just be the fastest of the two channels. So there are a couple of different factors that can affect processing architecture, and the first of which is the properties of the stimulus dimensions themselves. Take, for example, this red square over here. The color and shape of the square are perceptually separable dimensions. So separable dimensions are analyzable, which means they're easy to attend to independently and they can be processed independently. The brightness and saturation of the red hue, however, are integral dimensions. So these are not analyzable. It's very difficult to attend to them independently, and they tend to be processed holistically. Another factor that can influence processing architecture is the way in which visual attention is deployed to the visual field. So visual attention refers to the ability to select specific locations, objects, or attributes in the visual field for further processing while suppressing everything else. Focus of attention can be redirected to a new target, either reflexively or through purposeful effort, but the literature is divided about whether the allocation of attention to separable dimensions is object-based or space-based. So object-based models assume that attention is allocated to perceptual units, or individual objects or perceptual groupings, and that all the features of the individual perceptual unit are mandatorily processed, and this can be done in parallel. If you wanted to attend to a feature of a different object, then you would have to shift your attention to that other object. And evidence to support the object-based account comes from studies of visual short-term memory. For example, performance in memory tasks is better when the to-be-remembered features are parts of the same object compared to when they're parts of different objects. Space-based models have been described using a few different metaphors, the most well-known of which is probably the spotlight. So under the spotlight metaphor, attention is allocated to a contiguous region of the visual field. Items within the spotlight are processed extensively, but in order to just process anything outside of that spotlight region, you would have to shift that spotlight. Evidence to support the spotlight model comes from spatial priming and divided attention paradigms. So for example, there's a response time cost when a target appears in an uncued location compared to a cued location, because shifting attention from one location to another simply takes time. Another type of space-based model is described using a zoom lens metaphor. So in zoom lens models, the resolution of the attentional system is inversely related to the width of the attentional beam. So you could apply attention diffusely over a large area for easy discriminations, or you could concentrate that into a focused beam when you need higher resolving power. And evidence to support the zoom lens account has come from studies in visual search. So how does this all affect processing architecture? So we've done several studies over the years examining how different types of separable dimensions are processed. These lamp stimuli varied on the curvature of the top piece and the width of the base, and Dan and colleagues found that processing for these stimuli was serial and self-terminating. These two rectangles, I'll call them boxcars. Can you all see my cursor moving? Is it gone? Okay, let's try this. All right. So in the case of these rectangles, so this is a single stimulus. The saturation of the red hue varied in one rectangle, and the horizontal position of this bar varied in the other. And this was also found to be processed under a serial self-terminating architecture. When the same two dimensions were overlapped into a single rectangle, response time data was best fit by a model that allows for processing architecture to change from serial to parallel between trials. And in my honors year, we did an experiment where we varied some combination of saturation, orientation, and size in these rectangles across a few different conditions. And we also found that the mixed self-terminating model captured the data best. So kind of looking at this overall, we can see that separable dimensions are processed either in serial or in parallel. Now, looking at these past studies as a whole, we also noticed something a little bit interesting. When the relevant dimensions were presented in separate locations, the best fitting model is serial self-terminating, whereas when the relevant dimensions occupied the same location in space, we could process them in parallel. So this raised the overarching question for my PhD thesis, which is, how does the relative position of features in the visual field affect processing architecture? So I'm now going to present you the results of a series of experiments that I did in my PhD to address this question, and all of them use these two features as the relevant dimensions. So orientation of a line, there we go, and saturation of a red hue. To diagnose processing architecture, the stimulus space for all experiments was constructed using the logical rules design. So we have two dimensions, each of which vary on 3 levels, and we combine these orthogonally to produce 9 stimuli. The 4 stimuli in the top right corner make up the target category, which is defined by a conjunctive rule. So all items have to have an x value greater than or equal to x1 and a y value greater than or equal to y1. Because it's defined by a conjunctive rule, they have to be processed exhaustively in order to reach a correct decision. The remaining stimuli make up the contrast category, which is defined by a disjunctive rule. So items only need to have an x value equal to x naught or a y value equal to y naught. Because you can reach the correct decision after processing a single dimension, processing can self-terminate for these items. Items in the target category can be further defined by their discriminability from contrast category stimuli. So following general recognition theory, which is a multidimensional extension of signal detection theory, each stimulus in this space can be represented by a bivariate normal distribution of perceptual effects. So target items that lie close to the boundary would be more confusable with contrast category items because of the overlap in these distributions. And by the same logic, items that are further away have high discriminability. So we can actually combine the discriminability values on the two dimensions. And what we get is the stimulus in the bottom corner is called the low stimulus because it's got low discriminability on both dimensions. This one out here is high because it's got high discriminability on both. And then we have low-high and high-low. And the implication of this is that we should expect we expect a specific ordering of response times for these items. So represented here in the form of survivor functions, the low item, because it has two difficult decisions, would be expected to have the longest response times. High would have the fastest, and then low-high and high-low would fall somewhere in between because they have one low discriminability dimension value each. And so this ordering of the response times in the survivor functions is what we call stochastic dominance. So pin that in your noggins because it's going to come back later. And the contrast category items are named based on their position in the stimulus space. So this item down here is called a redundant stimulus because it satisfies both of the disjunctive rules for the contrast category. The items, my mouse keeps disappearing. The items next to the redundant stimulus are called the interior items, and the ones further away are called the exterior items. So we can use this design to diagnose processing architecture in a couple of ways. And the first is by applying a set of non-parametric analyses called Systems Factorial Technology, or SFT. So SFT is a set of tools that allow us to make inferences about processing architecture from patterns in response time data by utilizing that double factorial design that's embedded in the target category. In the interest of time, I'm only going to go through the predictions of serial and parallel models since we're dealing with separable dimensions. And in the case of the target category, I'm only going to go through the exhaustive counterparts because of that conjunctive. So the serial model, if we look at the mean response times for the 4 target category items, we can compute the mean interaction contrast, which is simply the difference between these 2 items minus the difference between these 2 items. So a serial exhaustive model would predict that the MIC would be additive or equal to 0. And that's because the difference between these 2 and these 2 is simply the amount of slowdown you're getting from changing discriminability on the second dimension. You can see that low and low cancel each other out, high and high cancel each other out. In the case of the parallel exhaustive model, on the other hand, the MIC is predicted to be under additive because the difference in response time from going from 1 low hard decision to 2 is a lot smaller than going from no difficult decisions to 1 difficult decision. So when we subtract these 2, we get negative value. We can do an analogous thing to the survivor functions to compute the survivor interaction contrast. A serial exhaustive model predicts that the SIC will be equal parts negative and positive, whereas the parallel exhaustive model predicts that the SIC will be entirely negative. We can also look at the pattern of mean RTs in contrast category items to work out the stopping rule because processing can self-terminate. In this case, spoiler alert, people always self-terminate, so I'm just going to show the self-terminating predictions here. In the case of the serial model, the interior item will be processed, the exterior item will be processed faster than the exterior item on 1 or both dimensions, depending on whether they are processed in a fixed order or a mixed order. Whereas with parallel self-terminating model, because of the min time rule, we don't expect to see any difference between interior and exterior items. All right. Now, SFT is very useful. It has the benefit of being non-parametric, but there are a few limitations to SFT. Firstly, they rely on the assumption of stochastic dominance. So if we observe any violations in SD, then we can't interpret the data. SFT can only be replied to correct response time, so we're only using a subset of our data, and it doesn't account for the patterns in error response times. And also, humans be human, sometimes the patterns don't really match up with anything, and that makes it really hard to interpret the data. So, and one more thing, SFT's predictions are restricted to what are called pure architectural models, so just serial, just parallel. Doesn't account for cases where you might change architecture across trials, or for any kind of interference or facilitation effects between channels. So we also fit computational models to the data. So the models we use have a GRT front end and an LBA back end. So we use NDS solutions to derive the mean locations and the standard deviations for these stimulus distributions. And then the marginal distributions are used to drive the drift rates for a set of accumulators. So there's a pair of accumulators for each dimension, one accumulating towards a target decision and the other towards contrast. So depending on the item, one will be correct and one will be incorrect. Yep. And so we fit a few different architecture models. Of course, we have the serial self-terminating and parallel self-terminating. We also fit that mixed serial parallel model. So this is that model that allows for some proportion of trials to be serial, and it has an additional PCR parameter that tells you what the proportion of serial trials was. We also fit a serial attention switch model. So this was used in some previous studies. And so this model is basically the serial model, but it has an additional parameter for the time cost of shifting the focus of attention through space. The mixed parallel serial attention switch model is a mixture model with where the serial component has the attention switch, time cost parameter built in, and then we also fit a couple of contaminant models. So we were a little bit concerned that maybe the mixture models were fitting better because they have a little bit more flexibility and kind of fit some of the noise in the data a bit better. So these models are basically your serial model and parallel model with some proportion of noisy trials mixed in that are drawn from a uniform distribution. So we fit the models using DMC-MC parameter estimation methods, and we compared fits using DIC. So that's all the technical stuff out of the way. Let's come back to the research question, which you're all here for. So going back to previous studies, we had the lamp stimuli, which were processed in serial, and then these whole object features, which could be processed in parallel. So when we compare them, the obvious thing that stands out is that the relevant dimensions here are kind of quite far away from each other, whereas here they're overlapped. So I don't know, maybe the lamps were processed in serial because they couldn't fit in a single spotlight of attention. So the first research question was, must features of a single object be overlapped in order to be processed in parallel? So the first experiment looks at the effect of feature separation on processing architecture when those features are part of a single object. We had 3 conditions in this experiment. The first is the overlap condition, so both saturation and orientation were presented in the same semicircle. So this was originally intended to be kind of like a control condition, since we've done similar studies to this one before. In the adjacent condition, the orientation and saturation were presented in separate semicircles, but there was no gap between them, so they came together to form a whole circle. And in the separated condition, we separated the two by a bar that was 1 degree in visual angle. Okay, so we use a small n design in these logical rule studies. So I had 15 participants in total, and they were randomly allocated to one of the 3 conditions, so 5 participants per condition. Each participant completed 9 categorization sessions, each of which was made up of 9 practice trials and 450 experimental trials. So these experiments were long. It typically took about 3 weeks for a participant to complete all of their sessions, but sometimes it took a little bit longer. Presentation of target and contrast category items was randomized within sessions for a total of 50 presentations per item per session. Participants were instructed to respond quickly and accurately. So accuracy was quite high for all participants. At the start of each session, the participant will be presented with a full stimulus space in order to expedite rule learning. And then each trial would commence with the presentation of a fixation cross, followed by a single item, remain on screen for 5 seconds or until a response was made. And feedback was provided for incorrect or timeout responses. If the response was correct, it would just move to the next round. To analyze response time data from this experiment, we applied SFT and computational modeling. But in order to support our interpretation of the patterns in the SFT analyses, we also conducted a series of statistical tests. So we ran KS tests on the survivor functions to ensure that they were ordered in the way that we'd expect to satisfy the stochastic dominance assumption. We did an 8x2x2 Bayesian ANOVA on target category response times to look for main effects, but also the interaction effect between the dimensions, which is the test for the MIC. And we also did KS tests on the SIC to see whether the most negative and positive points of the SIC differed significantly from 0. And for contrast category items, we did Bayesian paired samples t-test to compare the response times, the mean response times for external and internal items on each dimension. So there's a lot of data and a lot of analysis. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through how I interpreted the results for one participant, in this case, O1 in the overlap condition. And then I'll just present you with a summary of all those interpretations. So this is O1's data. We have the SIC, the MIC, and the contrast category mean RTs. First thing we do is we run the KS test to check that they have SD. So for this test, you want all these values to be significant and all these to be non-significant, and that's what we have in this case. So they've met the assumption of stochastic dominance, and we can apply our SFT analyses to this participant. Next is the Bayesian ANOVA. So here's a little guide if you're not familiar with how to interpret Bayes factors. So what we found for O1 was very strong evidence for a main effect of session, which means that they were speeding up over time, which you would expect after doing 9 sessions of this. And there's also a main effect of orientation and saturation. So that means that our discriminability manipulation had an effect on response times, which is what we want to see. There's also an interaction effect between session and saturation. So their saturation judgments were perhaps improving, speeding up across sessions. Most interestingly, there's very strong evidence of an interaction between orientation and saturation. When we look at the value of the MIC, it is negative. So this MIC, there's very strong evidence for an underadditive MIC, which is consistent with predictions of the parallel model. We also then did the KS tests on the SIC. So just checking whether the highest point and the lowest point differ from 0. In this case, D plus is not significant, D minus is. So only the negative portion significantly deviates from 0, which is consistent with the parallel model. So we conclude that the target category response times align with the predictions of the parallel model. Turning now to the contrast category, we did the pair comparisons on these 2 items. And there's no evidence that there's any difference between the mean RTs for interior and exterior items on either dimension, which is again consistent with predictions of the parallel model. So putting it together, we've got target category indicates parallel architecture, and contrast category also indicates parallel architecture. So here's a summary of all the interpretations for the participants in this condition. They are grouped according to pattern, and they're color-coded to make interpretation a little bit easier. In cases where you see question marks, it just means the pattern didn't quite match up with predictions in any of the models, so they're a little bit difficult to interpret. So what we found was evidence of parallel processing in all conditions, so overlapped, adjacent, and separated. And we found some evidence of serial processing for 4 participants in the separated condition, but only 1 in either the adjacent and overlap conditions. So looks like they don't really need to be overlapped necessarily to be processed in parallel. When we check the model fits, the data from almost all participants was best fit by one of these mixed serial parallel models. With some participants looking like they were actively shifting attention between the relevant dimensions. We did have one participant best fit by a serial contaminant model in the adjacent condition and a serial self-terminating model in the separated condition. But we are still seeing evidence of parallel processing across all conditions. One additional finding from this experiment came from the overlap condition, which we weren't quite expecting. So when we're recruiting participants, we have to make sure that they actually have SD in order to analyze their data. So if they show consistent violations like this, where you see low-low and high-low overlapping, we stop testing. And we had to do this for quite a few participants in the overlap condition, but not the other two conditions, which was a little bit surprising. But so looking at kind of in the adjacent condition, if the dimensions are processed in parallel, you would see response times being slowest for the low-low, because statistics, sorry, then followed by low-high, high-low, and and the high-high. But in the case of the overlap dimension, we're seeing high-low and low-low being equivalent. So what we think might be happening is if they're being processed in parallel, and there's something about the way this line is making this saturation look, that is making the saturation decision more difficult for this stimulus, then the slowdown would actually mask any difference you would normally expect to see between the response time for these two items. So to summarize for experiment 1, separable dimensions can be processed in parallel even when they're not overlapped, when they're part of the same object, which is actually consistent with both object-based and space-based accounts of visual attention. And overlap in separable dimensions can lead to lower-level feature interactions that can maybe affect decision timing. So the next obvious question was, will the features still be processed in parallel when they're presented in separate objects? So experiment 2 looks at the effect of feature separation architecture when dimensions are presented in separate objects. The first condition in this experiment was a replication of the overlap condition, but I shortened the line to hopefully minimize interference between the line and the saturation. Then we replicated separated conditions, so 1 degree gap there, but there's no adjoining bar, so they could be perceived as separate objects. And then to really push it, we increased the separation to 8 degrees of visual angle. So this is equivalent to the separation between the relevant dimensions in the lamp stimuli, which were processed in serial. Jumping right into the summary, we're already seeing a lot more yellow in the 8 degree separation than in the other conditions, but we still, oh, sorry, I should mention, shortening the line seemed to resolve the SD issues we had in the overlap condition. Evidence of parallel processing is found in all conditions, but it seems to be kind of more serial at the 8 degree separation. Looking at the model fits, again, a lot of participants were best fit by one of the 2 mixture models, but we're seeing the serial model fitting better for a couple of participants in the 8 degree separation condition and in the 1 degree separation condition. So a bit more variability in this condition than in experiment 1. And also, so the backstory is when we did the whole object features experiment, we were using different models. So we were using a random walk model, and we hadn't actually come up with these contaminant models. So I went back and I refit all the data from the whole object features experiment to our current set of models to see if we'd see the same pattern. And all the participants were unanimously best fit by the mixed serial parallel model. So their separation does seem to be having an effect on architecture. So summary for experiment 2 is shortening the radial line, resulted in cleaner data, which supports this idea that low-level feature interactions can affect precision times. And seems like features can be processed in parallel when they're presented in separate objects, which supports a space-based account of attention, and also at an extreme separation level. When you consider the limits of foveal and parafoveal vision, our most extreme separation actually kind of fit just nicely within parafoveal vision, but that means the lamps did as well. But one key difference between the semicircles and the lamps is that the lamps have a lot of extra detail presented between the relevant dimensions. So simple features can be processed in parallel when they fit within parafoveal vision, which would be consistent with a zoom lens model. So putting that together with the previous studies, we have saturation and orientation being processed in parallel when they're separated, but we have simple features like the saturation orientation being processed in parallel when they're separated, but not these more complex lamp stimuli. So next question we had was, well, okay, we've separated these stimuli along the vertical meridian, but what happens if we separate them horizontally? There's been several studies that have shown evidence of a bilateral field advantage. So the bilateral advantage is the observation that performance is improved when stimuli are presented bilaterally, so across both the left and the right hemifields, rather than unilaterally. One example is from a study that Keith and Dan did. So they had 3 conditions in the baseline. Participants had to track movement objects in one quadrant. In the bilateral condition, they had to track objects in 2 quadrants that were presented bilaterally, and then in the unilateral condition, both quadrants were presented in a single hemifield. So obviously there was an advantage to tracking 1 location over 2 locations, but performance was better when the objects were presented bilaterally than when they were presented unilaterally. So there's evidence to support this bilateral advantage has also been found in visual search and visual short-term memory studies. And this has been attributed to independent resources for attentional tracking in the left and right visual fields. Now it's unclear how this would affect processing architecture in the case of our stimuli. So we would expect to see no difference between vertical separation and horizontal separation if information is still integrated across the hemifields due to the connection between the 2 hemispheres. But if we see more evidence of parallel processing when they're separated horizontally, then this might suggest kind of bilateral advantage. So that brings us to research question 3, is processing more efficient when features are presented in different hemifields? So in this experiment, we replicated the adjacent and the 1 degree and 8 degree separated conditions, but we just presented them along a horizontal meridian. And looking at the summary, there's already a lot more blue than when they were separated vertically. So again, we found evidence of parallel processing in all conditions. And this time we only found evidence of serial processing for 1 participant in each condition in the SAT results. Looking at the model fits, surprisingly, when the 2 dimensions were closest together, we saw participants' data being best captured by serial models. Whereas when they were separated by 8 degrees, every participant's data was best captured by the mixed serial parallel model. So it seems like more participants were able to process features in parallel at 8 degrees of separation than 0 degrees. So it might be easier to process the features in parallel when they're presented in separate hemifields than when they're separated along the meridian. So could this be evidence of a bilateral field advantage in categorization? Now, obviously, this is a completely different set of participants, so it's hard to make a direct comparison, but it was interesting. And when we kind of consider this new result, again, in the context of past literature, we have these simple features being processed in parallel with a wide horizontal separation. But then we also have this result, if you recall, where we have the rectangle and the horizontal bar position, and these stimuli, while also simple, and very similar looking to these ones, being processed in serial. So what's the deal with these guys? So in order for this stimulus to be, missing a bar there, to be processed in parallel, then attention would need to be deployed to both of these dimensions simultaneously. Since they occur in different locations in space, this could only be in one of two ways, either by deploying attention diffusely across the entire stimulus, although the zoom lens model, or by splitting the beam of attention and having it operate simultaneously over the target regions. So when we consider the effect of distractors and what we know about how distractors affect our ability to attend to multiple locations, stronger bilateral field advantage effects have been found when tasks are more difficult or when distractors are present. So if the task is easy, then there's no advantage to be found, but when it's more difficult, then you actually start seeing evidence of the bilateral field advantage. Zoom and gradient models have been assumed to apply because you see interference only when distractors are presented between target locations, so suggesting that the region between the targets has to be processed. But there has also been evidence that you can split attention across two non-contiguous regions when the distractors don't have sudden onset. So Ron Paschler did an experiment where they had distractors appear on screen at the same time as the target. And then another condition where they applied a mask over the distractor and then removed the mask to reveal those distractors. So there was no sudden onset of distractors on screen that could capture attention. And when they did that, there was no interference from the distractors anymore, so that they argued that sudden onset of distractors between target locations captures attention, making it more difficult to attend to the two separate locations. So can this explain why these stimuli were processed in parallel? So looking at the lamp stimuli, one I didn't mention before, so I've talked about there being irrelevant features presented between the target dimensions that would increase perceptual load, but these irrelevant features also varied randomly from trial to trial. So we'd have sudden onset that would capture attention, preventing you from attending to the dimension, to the top and bottom in a split locus fashion, and also making it difficult to make these high resolution discriminations in the zoom lens account because of all this intervening information. And also, so the lamp shade varied, the stand also varied, and because we're dealing with curvature and width, there could also have been some low-level feature interactions affecting the perception of curvature and width of the base in the lamps. And then looking at these, I'm going to call them boxcars, we should see evidence of parallel processing in this case, but the issue with this bar position dimension is that the position changes from trial to trial. So the sudden onset of the bar in a different location every trial might capture attention, resulting in serial processing of the bar, then saturation. And it's not quite clear like how a kind of zoom lens account would apply here because the width of the beam would vary from trial to trial. So the research questions for my final experiment are, how does processing architecture change in the presence of distractors? So can attention still be applied to both features in the presence of distractors? And is serial processing being driven by increased perceptual load or attention capture? And the second question is there a bilateral advantage in categorization decisions? So do we observe the same pattern of results we saw in the third experiments when we compare performance within subjects? And does the introduction of distractors make this effect more pronounced? So I'm gonna talk very quickly now. So final experiment was distractor effects. We still used orientation and saturation as our dimensions, but now instead of semicircles, we have combined them into this rocket. So the orientation of the line would vary in the nose cone and saturation of red hue in the base. And we also made the separation a little bit smaller, 6 degrees, just so we could ensure they would fit nicely within parafield vision. Serial processing wouldn't be driven by limitations of vision. We varied, this design was varied on 2 factors. The first is alignment, so whether the rockets were pointing up or down or horizontally, and this was varied within subjects, so we could compare vertical to horizontal directly. And we also varied distractor type across conditions. So this is an example of the vertical rockets and horizontal rockets. In the no distractor condition, the rocket body was completely plain. In fixed distractors, the same design would be presented every time, so there would be nothing surprising about it. Participants could learn to ignore it. In varied distractors, the shape of the windows on the body of the rocket would vary from trial to trial. So data for this condition was collected by one of our former honor students, Eleanor Williams, because I was told to stop doing experiments. All right, we also had to change the design of the experiment a little bit. So we only did 4 in each condition this time. And we did 8 sessions per participant, but each session was 800 trials this time. So quite a bit chunkier than our previous experiments because of that within subject comparison. And we removed the redundant stimulus just to get the trial number down. Yes, so we varied presentation by session, and there were 2 sessions per rocket rotation. So I will present the summary of the SFT results and the computational modeling. I just wanted to point out that what I'm going to present you now is pulling of data from the 2 vertical orientations and the 2 horizontal orientations. All right. Oh, and I've color-coded the models for simplicity. So serials blue, serials yellow, parallels blue, and the mixture models for green. All right. So across the conditions, we see more participants being fit by the mixed serial parallel model when the rockets were aligned vertically. But most interestingly, now remember, this is a within subjects comparison. Participants who processed the rockets in serial when they were vertical were able to process them in parallel when they were aligned horizontally. We're also seeing more serial processing in the case of varied distractors than when there were no distractors or when the distractors were fixed. So processing of vertical rockets is more serial in the presence of distractors. Participants who processed vertical rockets in serial were able to process them in parallel when they were presented horizontally, which suggests a bilateral field advantage in categorization in the presence of distractors. So the overall summary for my PhD is that simple features can be processed in parallel when they're presented in separate locations and in separate objects, which is consistent with the zoom lens account of attention. The presence of distractors between features can make participants more likely to process the dimensions in serial when they're aligned vertically. But presenting those same features bilaterally can allow them to be processed in parallel even in the presence of varied distractors. So it seems like we can tap into the separate attentional resources of each hemisphere to facilitate parallel processing under more difficult conditions. So returning to our original question, how do we work out whether this spider is friendly or venomous? Well, it looks like we can apply attention diffusely across the entire spider if it's not too big and it's not too fancy looking. And if a second spider happens to pop out, you best hope that it pops out next to it. And that brings me to my acknowledgement slide. This slide has cobwebs on it, not just because of the spiders, but because it's been such a long time coming. So of course, I would like to thank my supervisors and committee members, especially Dan for all of his help and support throughout the years and for not kicking me out. Our research collaborators, Eleanor for collecting and analyzing the data in the varied distractor condition, and Paul for just all his help and chats with regards to MATLAB and SFT. the 3 people who care about SFT. Some of the data was collected by research assistants, one of them is here. Hi, Andrew. And part of the reason why it's taken me so long to get here is because I spent a huge part of my time teaching, and that's been kind of a core part of my experience as a PhD student. So I'd like to acknowledge all my teaching mentors here. And of course, my lab, No Lab, and all the friends of No Lab who have made this such a fun ride. As you can see by all the photos here, we have quite a lot of memories, lots of shenanigans.
Here's the you, Glenn.
We murdered Dave, we'll never forget.
It's fun.
And of course, I need to acknowledge my partner, Mark, and my little puppy Teddy, who you saw in the previous photos. Sort of putting up with my complete lack of participation in anything social the past few weeks.
So, good job. Despite some delays in takeoff, you brought it in with a few minutes for questions. So,
I hope that wasn't too fast.
so would anyone online like to ask a question?
I mean, normally I would say yes, but that was really clear and really good. Thanks, Sarah.
Yay, thank you. And thank you.
Oh.
I have a question. It's can we see Teddy?
Everyone can see this.
I think he knows we can see this.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good. Yes,
I do have a softball.
Yes, no, go for it.
Sorry, I'll wait for the Teddy.
I mean, it'll take him a minute. It's me. You go.
Okay. With the model, I was wondering if, because you have a lot of evidence of a mixture between serial and parallel processing, right? Do you get a sense of like proportions within that mixture, like how much parallel, how much serial?
Yep, so we can actually look at the piece here parameter, and I do have some slides.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I heard earlier, but they are.
We didn't collaborate, but this was.
it worked out extremely well.
So I haven't finished pulling out this parameter for all participants in all conditions, but we do
Okay.
see the proportion of serial trials that are mixed in being quite a bit higher in the 8-degree separation than in the other conditions, but it does vary
Right.
quite a bit from participant to participant.
So does this like roughly correspond to sort of like the categorical treatment of like what you saw with the SFT? Because like there was a mixture across participants there. Is the story kind of the same?
Like you're seeing more participants pushing towards serial whenever they're further separated, even though they're fit by the mixture model.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Portions higher. Alright.
Yeah, I guess on average.
I know it's kind of like weird comparison.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, and so this bar here represents the mean of the medians of the posterior distributions, which
Okay.
is here across participants. So I guess trying to come up with an elegant way to summarize that data is a bit complicated, but yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the most stark difference you see is really with this condition where P here is like pushing 80, 90 for participants, generally speaking.
That's very clear, thank you.
Stefan, did you have a question? I got a notification.
Yeah. No, a question. I mean, maybe it's a stupid question, but it seems that I mean, you've given a great overview of like what you can do with all these features and where you can put them in order to test this. So what do you think would happen if you have more features than that? Would you then force a very specific way of processing, or do you think it still depends on how many of the features are in different hemifields, for example, that you can still get?
That's a great question, and I think it would
processing.
come down to the number and the complexity. So orientation seems, but that line discrimination seems to be a little bit more difficult for people, and it can vary. So one of the reasons we did the rocket going up and down is because Philip suggested that orientation judgment might be more difficult depending on which quadrant you're actually doing it in. So I think it depends on how easy it is to make those discriminations, as well as where they're positioned in the visual field.
This is also a totally stupid question, seeing maybe I should already know this. Did we ever think about like refitting the lamp stimuli and stuff with the other models? Did we do that? Yeah. What happened?
Oh, you did that?
Serial attention switch.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. That's
I don't, I need to find it, but I know I asked you for the data and I got what I could. I think we didn't have all of it, but it was a
yeah.
serial attention shift model that fit the lamps better, so it was.
No,
really
I think we should have all of the lamps data because I ran that one. I think the one we don't have is the two boxcars side by side. So
Oh,
Mario
okay,
ran that, and the way in which he organized the data was a bit strange, or a bit different than I did it. I won't say. But I also think like he in the 2010 paper, it was serial self-terminating because we told people to do that. But in
That's
the
2011.
2008 paper, the 2011 paper. Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the 2011 data.
And
Gotcha.
that was when they just could choose their own role.
Yeah, so that's when you introduced the attention switch.
That's right. Yeah, and I should have that data. I forget what happened.
I'm pretty sure we refit it. I just don't know what I did.
Okay, we can have another look through the.
I'm not gonna say when I started my PhD.
Yeah,
I
cool.
also need to come back to that lamp data because I collected with Dan, I think, a bunch of
Oh, yeah.
full response data where you had to respond to each part independently and then the two together, as well as when there was nothing. And I need to go through that and see how that changes with this kind of stuff because it would be a really good insight into how this architecture and capacity changes.
By the time Pearl's doing her honors thesis, we'll probably get around to looking at that.
And it's a bit like that.
Stefan?
Yeah, okay. So maybe if there's time for one more question. You said at the beginning that there's you could only fit the data to correct responses, right?
Mhm.
But is there have you looked at whether like people who use very specific ways of doing it, like either go for a parallel or serial case in particular, since it doesn't look like everyone's doing the same thing, even for the same stimuli, is that correlated with more or less errors? So is there something about it that is actually beneficial, where you can say, well, that's the optimal way to solve it because then people make less errors? And when the stimulus becomes more complex or you do something to it, then actually switching to a different processing architecture might be better?
I mean, I guess anecdotally, one of the thoughts we had about that mixture model is when participants, you're sitting there for hours on end, you're tapping away, and you might kind of zone out, apply attention diffusely across two dimensions, and then you make a mistake. And then suddenly you kind of want to check, so you would actively direct attention to the relevant features to I guess, confirm or decision or increase your resolving power there. We kind of, because we incentivize high accuracy, we don't actually have a lot of error data to kind of work with and to sort of look at that. It'd be interesting if we just ignored SFT and then looked at model fits when we didn't kind of force high accuracy. That might be interesting to see.
Because the one where you, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm saying you fit the error data with the computational.
Yeah, but we don't have a lot of error
But there's
trials.
not, there's a lot of error. lower
Because we want a lot of correct trials so we can apply SFT. So, there is another meeting booked in
Oh,
here
I
at
remember-
12.
maybe I'll
and I
ask you while
don't
we're
know if
walking.
they're here or not.
They might be.
Being very polite.
Yeah.
Pointing inside.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I should
Thank
go.
you, everyone
Thank
online
you.
for joining us.
Thank you and congratulations. Well done.